Okay, there we go. Thank you much. All right, so we're going to focus again on column O, our revolving credit. Now, how would we want to look at that? What do we want to know? We basically want to segment it somehow, don't we? So we already know that revolving credit is between 0 and 2715. That doesn't really tell us much.
Could we look at the distribution?
We could look at the distribution. How would we do that?
Create a histogram.
There you go. So I think I can do the column. I don't recall anymore, but let's take a look. So I'm going to do my insert, recommended charts, and we're going to do a histogram. That's going to put it right here. Well, I didn't want to put it there. There we go. I can always move it. But basically, we have a crudely formatted histogram. We obviously do not have a normal distribution, do we? Doesn't look like a bell curve, does it? We have a normal distribution with the exception of the tails. So the majority of our clients have a revolving balance between 0 and 130, right? Almost 2,500 clients. And then we've got over 500 clients that have a revolving balance of 2,470 to 2,600. And then we have a normal distribution between those two tails, which is actually kind of interesting. So we know that the majority of our customers have a relatively low revolving balance. Are the odds I'm making a lot of money on these particular customers good or bad? Probably bad, right? If I have a low revolving balance, I'm not using my credit card much. Or I should say not for large purchases. Perhaps I'm using it quite a bit, but I'm buying $4 Starbucks instead of $100 other stuff or $300 other stuff. Okay, so now we have an idea of what we could focus on. Now these ranges are a little iffy. We could always change these ranges if we desired to. We would click on the axis, format axis, sorry. We could do a couple things. We could do a bin width. Maybe this Excel automatically determined that the bin width was going to be $130. Let's see what happens if we make it $500. All right, so now we have less bins. We have a little more interesting things to work with here. So between 0 and 500, we've still got around that 2,500, a little more, 2,596. And we've got somewhere, let's see, 1317 in the 500 to 1,000. Next category, 2258, 2291, 1136, 529. All right, so by changing the bin width, we've got a little different story, right? So let's see if we can, what if we did 750? What's that going to look like? All right, so now we're looking at the majority of our clients have a revolving balance less than 2250, right? But we know from our first histogram, most of those are going to be in the 0 to 350, a good chunk of them, right? All we've done is, remember that normal distribution curve that we had that had quite a few bins? We've lumped all those together. All those together equate to that first bar that we had, although we've lengthened this a little bit. So remember, we had that large bar from 0 to 350. So we took the 350s and maybe the next bar, consolidated those into this bar. We took about 8 bars and consolidated them here, and then we still have our tail over here. So we have the ability to look at our revolving balance. Now, how would we want to segment this revolving balance to determine what we should do? So let's think about that. Let me rephrase that question. First, our question should be, what do we do? In order for us to target a marketing campaign, because that's likely what we would do, right? We want to target a marketing campaign. We want to know how to target that campaign. What are some ways we can target a marketing campaign? We look at demographics, right? So chances are, and you'll see hardly any of this anymore, would we want to look at gender, Probably not. We could, it might be interesting. But let's start looking at how would we target our customers to determine who's using their credit cards, who I should rephrase and say, who has a large revolving balance versus who doesn't. One would think that income category might be a good way to look at. No, should I target individuals who are making 80 to 120,000, or should I target individuals making less than 40,000? Or we could look at the card category. Should I target my blue cards, my silver cards? Let's look at that first. That might be interesting. All right, so now we can start talking about using a pivot table to start digging into our data. Very easy pivot tables is simply to hit the Insert tab at the top. You'll see some options under your tables grouping in the ribbon that opens up, and you've got Pivot Table. If you click on Pivot Table, Excel is going to ask you, do you want to do from a table a range, which is within this worksheet, or do you want to go outside this worksheet and import something, or do you want to do Power BI, which we're not going to do right now. We're going to do just from within our table and range. Excel will automatically select your data. In our case, from cell A1 to cell U10,128. It selected all of our data on this worksheet. You have the option of placing your pivot table either into a new worksheet or into this worksheet. If you want to put it in this worksheet, Excel is going to want to know, where do you want to put it? You can't put it here because you're going to overlay your data. So you'd have to go find a blank cells to go put it in. You could go all the way over here and say, well, I want to put it right here. I typically don't do that. That just confuses the heck out of me, and you do a lot of scrolling. So I typically just say, let's put it in a new worksheet. Hit OK. A new worksheet is going to pop open. You'll notice it just defaults to the next sheet number, in this case, sheet 2. I've got a pivot table. I've got a pivot table with no data. So on the right side of your pivot table, you will see your pivot table fields. These are essentially nothing more than the columns of data that you have. Are all right here. We've got 4 options down here. We've got filters, columns, rows, and values. We're going to use those to create a new look at our data. So the first thing I think we'll do is we'll take our, and I think I said this last session, I'm going to interrupt myself and say this again. The best way to learn pivot tables is just to go and play with them. I could sit here and tell you how to do a pivot table, and I will, and tell you that this filters does this, columns does this, rows does this. And then when you wake up tomorrow morning, you're not going to have a clue what I said. Guarantee you. The best way is to get a data set. You now have a data set, and just play with it and see what it does. Right? You can't ruin your data by creating a pivot table. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at that card category. What if I put card category in rows? What happens? Well, wow, I just got all the rows for the card categories that exist. Now, if you want to know something about the data, you got to do something besides this. You need some values, right? So in this case, what if I want to know the number of blue cards, the number of gold cards, the number of platinum cards, and the number of silver cards that have been issued? Well, I need some values. In this case, I want to know the number of blue. That's a count, right? How many blues do we have? So if I take the same category and pop it over here in values, Excel is going to default that to the count of the card category. That's what your variable is now called. And essentially it's going to be right here in column B. And you now have a count. There's 9,436 blue cards. There's 116 gold cards, 20 platinum cards, and 555 silver cards. Now, these are cards. There's really nothing else we can do here. If you click on this little drop-down arrow next to your count and you hit value field settings, you've got some options. You could say, I want the sum. This makes no sense. I can't sum up blue, gold, platinum, silver. The average, I can't do that. I can't do any mathematical functions on this data, right? This is categorical data. You can't do any mathematical functions on it. So all I really can do is count here. All right, so now I know that by far, the majority of cards we issue are blue. Now, you can do a lot of interesting things. You can say, all right, I want to, what's that look like? What if I got to produce a visual on that? All right, so you go to your Insert tab at the top, In the ribbon that opens up, you've got some recommended charts, or you can pick your own chart. If you hit the recommended charts, Excel is going to show you a little preview of what your data is going to look like. If I chose the column graph, the clustered column graph, it's going to look like that. The line graph is going to look something like that. A pie chart is going to look like this. Let's go with our pie chart, see what we got here. So we're going to plop a pie chart in there. It's going to be exactly what I expected, right? The vast majority of the pie chart is going to be the blue cards. Now it just happened to show up blue. Got lucky. And then gold's going to be this little sliver here of 116. Platinum, you can't even see because there's only 20 of them. And then silver is 555. So we got a pie chart. Now, as we discussed last week, this is a horrible chart because it has no title, right? It does have a legend. It's not a great legend, but it's a legend. It does say card category. But we would need to put a decent title here for this to be a realistic chart. You could right click on here. We could add data labels, and this will tell us, we're gonna have to move some of these. Oops. It's not always easy to do. So we can put our data labels in there, which might be effective to show how many of each to truly give the picture. Let's make this, let's go click on the chart, go to our home tab. Let's bold all this. And let's make these a black font so they're a little more distinguishable. Okay, now I've got coming up with a decent graph here, right? I could title this total number for each card category, something descriptive in your title. So that was pretty easy. Incredibly easy. I could click here on the chart. I could right click and say change chart type and get back to my screen. Let's say I wanted to have a horizontal bar chart. All right, let's go take a look at it. Basically, now what I have is not a very appealing graph, but it does tell the story. The majority of the cards are blue. 16 are gold, or 116 are gold. They're not even showing up on here because of our scale. I don't know if I could get them to show up. Yeah, there we go. I'll have to widen this out probably further than I possibly can to get the 20 to show up. Still not showing up, but there you go. Not as visually appealing than the pie chart in this particular case, but it's the same data in a different visual format. But this really doesn't tell us anything, does it? It just tells us the number of cards. We want to go further into this. Let's get rid of that. We want to go further in. Oh, by the way, if you click outside of your data, your pivot table columns go away. To get back to your pivot table columns, you just need to click somewhere inside your data, and it brings your pivot table fields pane back up. All right, so we know the number of counts. That's really not what we're looking for, though. So in this case, what we want to do is, let's get rid of that. Let's play with a couple things here. We had said we wanted to look at revolving balance, total revolving balance. What if I pop that down in rows? What's that going to do? All right, well, that's ugly. Doesn't tell us anything, does it? So basically what it's saying for all blue cards, here's the data values you have for total revolving balance. Now, if I were to add a count, it would tell me how many zeros, how many 132s, how many. It's not telling me anything, right? So right away we can see, okay, total revolving balance doesn't make sense there. What if we add it over in the values count? Now, in this case, Excel has defaulted that particular new variable it created as the sum of the total revolving balance. Can't think of a more useless piece of information at this point than that, right? So let's hit the drop down. Let's go to our value field settings. How about an average? Seems to make a little more sense, perhaps. All right, now I'm going to click on this, right click on this column. I'm going to format this column and say, okay, well, I want to at least look at currency. All right, so here's our average total revolving balance by card, as well as a total average revolving balance. Not much separation here, is there? So if I'm looking purely at average total revolving balance, my data indicates that targeting any one particular card customer is not going to give me much bang for my buck. I basically have to target all of them. Now you can do the same thing. You can click in here, you can do your insert, you can do all kinds of your graphs. We can go back to our pie graph. you see very few pie graphs that almost perfectly equal 25%, but that was pretty darn close for data, right? So we could see there's really no value on specifically targeting a particular card. Let's close that out. So that's not necessarily working for us. So what if we looked at, let's add something in here now. What do we got? The other column we were going to look at was their average utilization ratio, right? Let's pop that down here and see what that does. In this case, this is going to be the sum of the average utilization ratio. That's not going to help us. Is there anything we can do with this? Count's not going to make sense. Mathematically, I know they'll tell you you can't take the average of an average, but in many times in business, we do take an average of an average. So if I look at the average utilization ratio, right? It's basically telling me if I took off the word average on utilization, I could look at the average utilization ratio per card. Even though it's the average utilization per customer, it's still a valid metric. Does that make sense? So I could look at the average. In this case, this is no longer a dollar field. This is going to be a ratio, right? So our average ratio, now we're getting a story that's interesting. So the blue card average utilization ratio is actually higher than the other cards. But now we have something interesting to deal with. So we know that individuals who have the blue card on the average have a higher utilization ratio. They're using their card more often. So let's go back to our data. Let's see what we've got to work with here. Let's see here. These are trends. I'm not too worried about trends right now. What about total transaction amount in the last 12 months? So if I knew what their average or their total transaction, their average total transaction amount, I could put that data with their card utilization ratio, and I could basically get a look into our consumers using their cards for larger or smaller purchases, right? For the most part. Now we would also have taken into account total transaction count. So let's do some work over here. Let's go back to our pivots. Click in our data. Let's add some columns in here and see what we come up with. Let's go ahead and take our transaction amount. Let's put it in values and let's right click value field settings. Let's make that an average. All right, so our average total transaction amount on the platinum card is highest, right? Let's go ahead and add the other one while we're here. Total transaction count. In this case, let's do an average. Do I want that to be a currency? Okay, so what do we got here? All right, so in total transactions, the blue is actually lower, right? So that means essentially, if I look at data that shows the average total transaction count is lower, total transaction amount is lower, there's really nothing in this data without running some more tests to tell me that people who have a blue card are using their cards for larger or smaller transactions. There's really nothing here that suggests that, right? Because basically, if I look at, I've got 4,064 transactions, 7,081 transactions, 8,000 or 9,086 transactions, 6,574 transactions. If I graph that, that would almost look like a linear relationship. Right, so as total transactions goes up, so is the transaction amount. True? So if I start at 64, I'm at 40.25. If I jump to 74.70, I've gone up to 65.90. If I go to 81.52, I've gone up to 76.85. If I've gone 86.95, you get the idea. Anytime you see two data variables increasing together, such that if I look at the lowest of both, it's blue. If I look at the second lowest for both, it's silver. If I look at the third lowest for gold, for both, it's gold. These are all matching up perfectly. Is it a perfect linear relationship? Of course not, but it's clear that as total transactions goes up, so does the total transaction amount, which kind of makes sense. If I'm using my card more times, I'm going to have more transactions. So I would have a higher transaction amount, right? We would expect a correlation between those data fields. So although it sounded like a good idea, this didn't tell us squat. Right? Basically told us that as people use their credit cards more often, they have a higher total transaction amount. Well, we could have started 30 minutes ago and assumed that. So we really haven't figured anything out here. So let's go ahead and put those back. And now let's look at what else can we look at to see transaction count. I'm sorry, go ahead, Heather.
Could we look at months inactive to see if they're actually using the card?
Months inactive. So let's go with an average, right? Pretty consistent across the board. So the only thing we know right now is that individuals using with a blue card have a higher utilization. And I misspoke earlier. I led you to believe that indicated they were using their card more often. And that's not what that says, right? If you remember what that says, that means that their credit used divided by their total credit, their ratio, they're using more of their credit available. So that can play into a lot of things in a banking relationship. That could indicate I'm using a lot of credit and I have a low credit balance or a low credit limit, sorry. Right? So when we go back, I kind of took us down a wrong path and I apologize for that. This particular column is really telling us that individuals who have a blue card are using more of their available credit than the other three cards. From a bank perspective, that's good, right? We want you to use your credit. All right. However, even though they're using more of their credit, their average total revolving balance is not that much different than the other cards. So if all things stay the same and one thing is different, you have to look at what's the possible reasoning for that. One could be the fact that their credit limit is lower. So just based on what we have here, we made a couple assumptions. We are assuming that the blue card is a card that has a lower credit limit, that a gold card has a higher credit limit, that a platinum card, we don't know, but is higher than blue. Silver card, we don't know, and it's higher than blue on the average. Hey, there's something we could look at, right? Let's look at our credit limits. Average credit limits per card. There you go. All right, so we've proven that out. The blue card is maybe their entry-level card for the entry-level customer. Has average credit limit of $7,300. When you get to the gold card, you have a $28,000 limit. Platinum card is a $30,000. Silver card's a $25,000. So perhaps the order of cards is blue, silver, gold, platinum, which actually would make some sense. That's actually how American Express does theirs. What a coinkydink. All right, so we know that individuals who have a blue card have a lower credit limit on the average. They also are using more of their credit limit. Now that alone doesn't tell you a lot. That would kind of make sense. If I only have a $7,000 credit limit, it doesn't take much for me to get to a 29%, right? 29% is about 30% of 7,000. However, if I charge, let's say it's $2,000, well, it's probably about $1,500. If I charge $1,500 on this credit limit, I'm already at 29%. If I charge $1,500 on this credit limit, I am nowhere near 29%, am I? right? So a $1,500 purchase is going to impact my credit more when I have a blue card than if I have a gold card, depending on my credit limit. Remember, this ratio is how much credit you've used of your credit limit. A $1,500 purchase is going to have a bigger impact on a smaller credit limit. Everybody still with me, or did we all fall asleep?
Still here with a question.
Okay.
Would it make any sense to try to find what the difference would be between attrited customers and existing customers with respect to, say, age? Maybe they aged out, maybe their income changed, maybe they have a higher number of dependents, for example, things like that.
Certainly. Let's take a look at that. Great idea, Heather. Let's throw our attrition flag here into our rows and see what happens. So when you throw your categorical data in your rows, you basically split your data up, right? So what we've done is we've taken our blue card, the consumers who had an average of 29% utilization ratio and an average credit limit of $7,300. I've now broken that out into, here's my attrited customers, customers who have left versus existing customers. So I can see now that my existing customers have the utilization ratio of 0.31, which is consistent. Customers who have left, however, are 17%, not using as much of their credit limit. And we can see that their total revolving balance is smaller, right? So that would indicate people are using their credit cards for just a little bit, and then they're getting out of the relationship with the bank. There's a much less significant difference when I look at all three of the other cards. So the natural question would be, what are the counts here, right? What are the counts? So what if we took, what do I need? I think if I took card category, and if I put it over here, and if I made it counts, and if I actually made it a reasonable number. So if you remember, I had 9,436 blue cards, which is true. I actually don't need any decimal places. All right, so we start looking at the number of customers. We obviously have a lot more customers here anyway. We look at, we have not near as many with the gold card, hardly any with the platinum card, with the silver card. So does this tell us anything? How about if we wanted to look at our attrited customers and try to target attrited customers? Where should we look? Where should we target? Well, do I want to spend a lot of time trying to figure out why platinum card holders are churning? It's pointless, isn't it? There's only 5 of them. I want to look at why are blue cards, which are our lower credit limit individuals, why are these people leaving us? We've got 1,500 people. These are just a drop in the bucket. Now, granted, it's 5 out of 20 leaving on the platinum card. You could be concerned about that, but if you're going to do some kind of major campaign, really, I would look at targeting getting more people to move to the platinum card. That's a different question. In this case, if we look at why people are leaving, we really want to focus in why are people who have blue cards leaving our bank and churning their cards. Those of you in supply chain would recognize this if we put this in a Pareto diagram and say, what should we focus on first? What we focus on first is attrited customers in the blue category, because they represent well more than 80% of the total problem. All right, so now we've learned a couple things. Learning is wonderful. What else should we look at here? Now, another way we could do this, I'll go through this. We could take our attrition flag and put it up in filters. What that does is move your attrition flag to the top. And now we're looking at all, both attrited customers and existing customers. Now it's turned that data variable into a filter. So now if I click here, I have the option of looking at just attrited customers, say, and hit OK. Or I can switch my view to be existing customers. Or I could look at all together. In this case, it really doesn't help us much because in this case, we really want to compare these. So the filter option doesn't make a lot of sense for us. We can put that back down here again. So you see how just moving things around and playing with them is really how you figure out a pivot table. The key is you have to know your data to know that when you do something, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like you can't average the number of, you can't perform mathematical functions on a categorical data element. So you can't add blue plus gold plus platinum, which doesn't make any sense. All right, so now back toward our original question, we have a little bit of information on blue cards, which we would expect because blue cards by a vast majority are the most popular card that we issue. But now we still haven't figured out what are the demographics of these attrited customers. So let's take a look.
Could we drill down on the blue one since we know that that's where the issue is and get the extemporaneous gold, platinum, and silver off?
Possibly. Well, yeah, we could. I was thinking first we go ahead and take our attrition flag and put it back here. Let's go back to who our problem is, right? And then start digging into what are the demographics for these individuals. These 1,600 customers are of concern to me. So let's say I take gender. Is this an issue? Female, male, I didn't expect so. Right? So 890 are females, 629 are males. Not too significant of a difference, and I wouldn't expect there to be. So I wouldn't necessarily generate a marketing campaign to say, hey, let's go market, let's target female customers who have a blue card and find out why they're leaving our bank. It doesn't make a lot of sense here. So I don't think gender is the way to go. Perhaps let's look at age. What is age doing to us? Well, that's not going to work in that format, now is it? So we're going to have to do something different with age. We'll get to that in a minute. How about education level? What's that going to do to us? All right, so that gives us some interesting data. Do we have any significant difference between education? Now remember, this is self-reported education. So that's as accurate as the reporting customers. For our blue card, and remember, we have filtered now by attrited customers. So all these customers have left the bank and turned their cards. So at the college level, 143, the doctorate level, 91, the graduate level, 450, 287 for high school, 83 for postgraduate, 222 for uneducated, 243 for unknown. Again, unknown really should be reported as prefer not to answer, most likely. It's not that people answered, I don't know what my education level is.
Can I ask you a question about the data set?
Sure.
The people who have, as an example, I see that graduate level is quite high. Is it possible that they were flagged as attrited, but they actually bumped up to platinum perhaps because they have a better concierge, better point system? I don't know what they consider attrited. Did they leave the company or did they just leave that status as blue?
Excellent question. However, in this particular case with this data set from this bank, the flag is a binary 1-0 flag that basically says you're an existing customer for any account, right? So it's not, you wouldn't have a record, the fact that you left your blue card and another record here saying you now have a silver card necessarily.
Thank you.
Is that right? You know what? How can we check that? Data analyst.
The customer number.
Customer number. And how could we check that by customer number?
To see if they're unique or if you have dupes.
Exactly. Now there are tools to determine whether you have unique numbers or not. I'm not going to cover those tonight. Those are tools that we'll get into in our fourth session. However, we could potentially just take a quick sort. It's not by any means 100% accurate. Look at whether we have duplicated data. But we could do, in this case, we could just do sort smallest to largest. And we could do a quick scan to see if we have any numbers that appear to be repetitive. I don't see a lot. I don't see any, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. We'd have to actually run a check to determine that. And we'll cover that in our next session. In this case, though, when I just look at the first 200 rows, I'm seeing all unique numbers. I'm not seeing any numbers that are repetitive. Excellent question. All right, let's go to our pivot. All right, so we have now determined by college or by education level, do we have anything significant? Maybe, maybe. The downside of that is, do we really have a mechanism to target blue card holders who went to graduate school? Probably not, right? Probably not. Let's open up our pivot table fields again. Let's look at income level. Pop that down into rows. Okay, now this might be interesting. Let's see what we got here. So for individuals who are making more than $120,000 a year, remember that again, this is self-reported. We have 113 that are churning their cards, or at least have attrited from the bank. And then we have 257 from the 40 to 60 category, 172, 80 to 120. All right, so here we go. If we look at our less than 40 and we look at our 40 to 60, right? If I click on cell E6 and hold my control down and click on E9, if you look at the bottom of my Excel, it's going to give you the sum of those two numbers that you clicked. Whatever you highlighted, it's going to sum for you. You can see that I've selected 2 cells. The average is 422. The sum is 843. So more than 50% of my blue card holders who have attrited are represented by individuals who make less than $60,000. Okay, now we got something, right? So lower earnings are correlated to individuals who are attriting from the bank, potentially churning their cards. If I look at my other data, numbers are really too small to draw any conclusions whatsoever for gold and platinum because so few people have attrited. I don't have any significant trends in my silver either. So now we've really narrowed down our potential issue to blue card holders who make less than $60,000 a year. They're leaving the bank. So can we dig in a little further even? Let's take a look. One thing we could look at is, well, how invested are these customers in our bank? Right? So, okay, we've got these people leaving the bank. Are they just people who have randomly opened a credit card and that's it? So how about what's their total relationship count? That's going to tell me how many accounts do they have at my bank. If they only have one account, I may not even care. Right? But if they got 3 or 4 accounts, if they are customers who have a vested relationship with my bank, that might tell me something. So we could take our total relationship count. Let's plop that one down into our values. Now, here's again, a couple things. One is we don't want currency. Let's take that to a number. There's not going to be a decimal because we're not going to do averages. Let's go back and change our sum. Sum makes no sense here. Let's go to a count. But that's not what I want. I'm sorry. We did want to average. We want an average. Here we go. All right, so now I got to go back and probably put my decimals back in. I apologize. Got ahead of myself. All right. So when I start looking at these particular customers segmented by income, when I look at their average relationship count, I'm not seeing anything significant here. So my initial assumption, or at least my initial guess of, hey, these are customers that have no relationship with our bank. They just got one account, is not true, right? There's actually very little significant difference. There's no significant difference between any of these. They all have 2 or more accounts with us. So we can look at that 2 ways. From a bank perspective, this is great news. I have an opportunity. These customers who have attrited from their credit cards most likely still have a relationship with us unless they close all their accounts. Now, to do that, we would need to merge with another data set that would show us checking accounts, money markets, savings accounts, and all that. We don't have that right now. Or these could be 3 credit cards. Who knows? And they may have attrited from all the credit cards. If it's a different brand of credit card, different, some banks have multiple types. They have a rewards card and a non-rewards card. Let's assume these are the only 4 cards this bank issues. So that would indicate, assuming we have unique values, which we do, at least we looked at in our customer number, that these customers have different accounts besides their credit card account. That could be a good thing. So one other item we can look at based on the data that we were given is there was some kind of contact count in here. All right, the contact count for the last 12 months. That means how many times has the bank talked to this person, contacted that person? Now I need to go back over to our other data set or our other worksheet. Sorry, let's see if we have more information on that. Number of contacts in the last 12 months. So it doesn't really tell me whether those were emails, phone contacts. That's something as a consultant we'd probably want to know. But we at least know that the bank has contacted that customer this number of times in the last 12 months. So I think that's a useful data field. Let's take a look and see of the customers who are attriting, are we contacting them or not? So let's take our contacts count. Let's put it down in our values. In this case, again, we're going to want the average. So Excel defaulted to sum. Let's click this little arrow next to our variable. Let's go to our value field settings. Let's make this an average. Let's again remove the currency format. Let's go ahead and leave the decimals because we are doing an average. Okay, so we're contacting these customers and they're still leaving us. If you remember, our rows of interest at this particular time were the 40 to 60 income level and the less than 40 income level. So we're contacting them close to 3 times, but we're not contacting them any less than these other folks. So what would be a natural question here? Anybody got a natural question? Where if I took all of these, actually, I did, the pivot table tells me this, my average contacts for all customers who have attrited from this bank, recall that we do have the filter of attrited up here, is 2.97. We're contacting these customers on an average 3 times. I see no significant difference between type of card or income level. So the natural question in your head should be, how many times are we contacting customers who have not left my bank? Right? Are we contacting them 10 times? Is that why they're staying? All we have to do is come up here, and this is the beauty of pivot tables. It allows you to start doing this type of what if question, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and change my filter from attrited to existing. All my data is going to change. Now we're looking at customers who are still existing, same pivot. But in this case, we find some interesting story here. Our bank, if we were the CEO of this bank and we were looking at this data, we could actually look and say, our employees are actually doing a good job. They are actually contacting our attrited customers more than they're contacting, on the average, our existing customers. We've got a higher touch for these people leaving. So we can't necessarily say, hey, these people are not leaving our bank because they never hear from us. Now, things that we would, the beauty of this data Data never gives you full answers. I shouldn't say never, doesn't always give you full answers, right? A lot of times data will generate questions that requires more data. So in this case, we would want to go back to this bank and say, hey, how are you contacting these customers? Is it through email? Let's say the bank comes back and says, we only use email. We never call customers. We could go back and say, well, you know what? I got to tell you something. Your average of 3 emails per customer who are leaving your bank aren't working. It's great you're doing 3, and you're doing 2.5 on the average to your existing customers, but that's not the reason your customers are leaving. So you can start inferring a couple things from your data that requires you to go back to the client or back to the whoever gave you the data and say, hey, we need to know some more information here. How are we contacting these folks? It's not working. All right, so let's see here. What else we got? We tried marital status. Well, we didn't try marital status. I would expect that would tell us absolutely nothing. Let's try it though. Let's take our income category out. Let's put our marital status in. We have 4 categories: divorced, married, single, effectively unreported. Let's go back to our numbers. This is just count of card category. That just tells us blue cards versus gold. That's not going to tell us a lot. Our average of total relationship count, nothing significant here. Contacts are not going to change. So really, marital status doesn't tell us much of anything.
What is the average open to buy? What does that tell us?
What was the question, Heather?
I didn't know what the line item average open to buy. I didn't know what that was in reference to.
Average open to buy. Let's go back to our original worksheet where I added the second row, average open to buy. And it may not have a good open to buy credit line, average of last 12 months. So that's basically, that's a good question. Average open to buy. They're awfully high numbers. I'd have to look that one up. So that's a great illustration of we have to understand our data, right? So if we were presented this data as analysts and we had this cryptic description of this particular column, we'd have to go back and say, hey, what does that mean exactly? Open to buy credit line. Let me think about that. I'm not a banking person. Open to buy credit line, average of last 12 months. Well, so if we do a logical analysis, let's take a look at row number 3. What if I took these 2 numbers and summed them? Remember, if I highlight the numbers, I get the sum at the bottom. Oh, it comes to 8256. I can now figure out what this is, 1434. So this is my total revolving balance. This is the unused credit. It's open to buy more, right? So it's no more than your credit limit minus your current revolving balance. So we don't need to go back to the person who gave us the data. We figured it out ourselves. So basically, it's the open credit line. Here's how much credit you have left. Excellent question. All right, so we've done some analysis. Let's go back to our pivot. We've done a lot here. Our average of credit limit, that really wasn't giving us much. Utilization ratio, we did see some interesting things there.
Did we look at age? I can't remember.
We did, but we got to figure out a different way to look at age. So the problem with age, if you remember, is we're going to have a lot of mess here. What we would really need to do is we would need to
segment like 45 to 50.
Segment and group our ages, which is going to be a topic for our 4th class. What do you do when you get data like this and you need to group it? So I don't want to try to cover that in 20 minutes. So we'll come back to age. So now what if we needed to tell the story visually, the story that we currently have, right? We want to tell, we've analyzed the data. We now have to report back and say, okay, what have we found? If you remember, we have found that customers who make less than $60,000, as included in these two particular segments, are accounting for a large proportion of our attrited customers, right? More than 50%. Blue card. Their average relationship count, if I look at these two, you know, it's still, well, that's not going to work. So I highlighted those. So if I average these averages, which I know is not something that you typically do, it's not going to tell us much. We didn't find anything significant in our number of accounts that's telling us that that could potentially be a reason or any correlated in any sense to why people are leaving. And we also looked at our average contacts, and we haven't gotten much there either. Don't have much significant difference. We can't logically conclude that the reason these folks are leaving is because they're not hearing from the bank. So if they're like the average consumer, certainly me, I don't want to hear from my bank unless there's a problem, to be honest with you. I don't want the bank contacting me trying to sell me new stuff. So that maybe we're over contacting them. So again, the question now becomes, what does this mean? You're telling me in this data that you've contacted the customer. Does that mean it's a contact attempting to upsell them? Is that a contact to say, how's your life? How do you like our bank? Is it a survey, right? So contact can mean a lot of things that's not shown in this data. Let's say these are all contacts that are solicitations to either open new credit cards or new accounts. You know, I get contacted by, I finally got out of Bank of America. Good heavens, it took me years. You know, once they get you in, it's like getting rid of a fungus. But once you get rid of somebody like Bank of America, which is a very large bank, you know, every month I get something from Bank of America when I was a customer telling me I need to upgrade my credit card. I need to do this. I need a different savings account. I need this. So if we're counting that as a contact, maybe this is not a good thing. Maybe you're just annoying people. However, if I'm annoying these people that have attrited on the average 3 times a year, I'm also annoying my existing customers a little less, but they're not leaving. So I'm not sure there's anything there. We would really have to know what the definition of contact is. Is that somebody picking up the phone saying, hey, how are you? I'm your banking customer service person. I've never gotten such a call from a bank in my life. How are you doing? How do you feel? How do you like our bank? Or is it a customer survey? You get the idea. You'd have to understand what this contact is. But we have found no significant reason why we would conclude that the number of contacts is affecting our attrition rates. So basically our data, what we have been able to show with our data is that people who have blue credit cards and make less than $60,000 are more likely to churn or attrite from our bank. That is one conclusion from this data that we can 100% with 100% confidence show. Everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
So when we start looking at, let's take out some of the data elements that have not been extremely relevant to us. Let's take rid of that. I'm going to come back. I'm going to take the average utilization out for now. I'm going to take the contacts out. It's not showing us anything. So we've got a couple things here. We have our average total revolving balance. That doesn't really tell us anything at the moment. We'll come back to that. So really, here's what our data has shown us. So with pivot tables, one thing you can do with a pivot table, as long as you're clicked in your pivot data, if you go to your insert and go to your recommended charts, again, the Excel is going to suggest some charts for you. Some will be hey, cool. Some will be absolutely ridiculously unreasonable. Some will tell you can't even do them, which is good because you can't do a stock report on this or a stock chart or stock graph. So if I look at the column, a clustered column, let's see what it looks like in real life. I'm hitting the wrong button. So I can tell you now when you do pivot tables, you have the ability to group your data. This is extremely difficult to do without using a pivot. I've done it. It's ugly. You actually need to write some code to make that happen. So if you just had this data sheet right here and you wanted to have a clustered graph like this, it would take you a very long time. Pivot tables are the way to go, right? So this pivot table immediately has segregated everything into my blue, gold, platinum, and silver categories. I can see right away with this graph that the preponderance of customers have a blue card, right? Because nothing's even registering here hardly. And then I could also see if I look at my income levels, I can, if I'm presenting this in some sort of presentation, I would say, and you can see immediately that the less than 40K customers in the blue card category are the customers that are leaving this bank, with the 40 to 60K shortly right behind them. So that's one way to visualize this data, right? And then you can tell whoever you're presenting to that there's not much going on in these categories. First of all, we don't have a lot of customers that even have these cards that have left the bank. So we can change our graph by just changing our filter. Let's go to our existing customers. The story is not much different. We can say essentially that the majority of our customers have a blue card, first of all, either existing or attrited. We do not have a lot of customers in the silver, gold, or platinum range, which would kind of make sense, right? This is real data. We also have a large majority of our customers have less than $60,000 as income, whether it be attrited or existing. Let's put them together, shall we? Let's start with a summary here. Okay, so here's what all our customers look like, whether they've left the bank or not. The majority of our customers make less than $60,000 a year. And they're in the blue card category, which makes sense. If I'm making less than $60,000 a year, the odds are pretty low. I'm going to have, let's go first with silver card. Well, not as low. We got 99 right here. Whoops, less than 40. We have 130 that actually have a silver card. But as we get up to our gold level, which would be next, we have only 24. When we get up to our platinum card, we have 4. So a bank leader might generate the question of how does somebody making less than $40,000 a year qualify for a platinum card? Platinum cards usually have high fees, right? They usually have a lot of perks with them. That might generate some new questions that might require some new data. How do we have these 4 people with this card? But back to our original story, which is the majority of our customers have blue cards, and the majority of the ones leaving are less than $60,000 a year. That could spur us to generate some sort of campaign to target these folks. So I could look at all my existing customers right now. Let's go back to our existing. Apologize for shifting a lot. So who is at the most risk of leaving this bank right now? At least for the credit card, would be these individuals right here and these right here. I may want to target these customers to try to keep them at my bank. If I've put all my data together and found out a root cause of why these customers are leaving. We know it's not contacts necessarily. And this type of data that we have, this quantitative data is probably not going to tell us that. We're going to have to go to some qualitative data. Qualitative data meaning we're going to have to probably look at some surveys. We got to do some kind of customer survey to figure out root causes. For those of you in supply chain with Six Sigma, we're going to have to look at why are people leaving. We don't find any significant categorical reason why people are leaving, i.e. gender, marriage, education other than the demographic of salary income. Now we'd have to switch to some qualitative data to truly dig into why are people leaving in these two categories so that we can start addressing the issue. Okay. Get rid of that. Let's go back to our pivots. I think we've covered most everything. I had told you earlier, you can just start playing. What if I took my income category and put it in the column? All right, so now you can see I've shifted my data. Right? My categories now are running across as columns rather than as additional rows. So I've got my blue, gold, platinum, and silver. I now have my income categories running as a horizontal row across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. So that might even be the better look. If you remember what it looked like here, blink. Now, if you want to put it in a more tabular fashion, we can put it right there. That actually is a little better. Okay, then if you put your flag back into your rows, then you start looking at a different looking table that puts both sets of data together again. You can start playing with recommended charts. In this case, when you have bunches of data, not bunches, but when you have different categories and rows and a different category and columns, your graphs start getting a little weird, right? In this case, is this a useful graph? Let me take a look here. Well, let's just go ahead and take a look at it a little more. Let's undo that. I didn't mean to do that. Let's make this a little larger. What do we got here? So we basically bunched all our income categories into different colors in the legend within our higher categories of attrited customers, existing customers, and our cards. Right. So we've segmented this data in 3 different ways. This is an interesting graph. I don't know if I would recommend this being a graph that would go to senior leadership. It's kind of hard to read, right? When you start having a lot of different data series, you start having complex graphs. People, when you present information to clients or to leadership, you need simple graphs that they can look at and understand without having to think about it too hard, right? That's the beauty of visualization. You want some kind of visualization that speaks without requiring a lot of thought. And the worst case is you don't want people to have to interpret, because when people interpret, they don't all interpret the same way. This one's not too terribly complex. The problem here is you've just got so many data fields here, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's not over the line by any means. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Again, it depends on who you're presenting to. You can look at other graphs. I don't think there's going to be any other graph that's going to make a lot of sense here. Pie chart's not going to make much sense at all. It's just going to have a bunch of pieces of all kinds of stuff. Let's see what we got here. All right, so in this case, this is just a bad graph, right? I've got blue attrited customer. So this is the blue category of card who have left. This is the blue existing. Well, I guess we can see that we have a majority of blue cards. And then if I look at the gold with, it's gonna be a little tricky for me. I'm somewhat colorblind between colors. So we look at gold, I can see that we have yellow and this little gray slice right here. I think that's gray. Well, I know it's gray. Everything looks almost gray. We look at my platinum, which is, I have no idea because blues and greens are a problem for me. When you look at a pie chart, it basically goes in order. So if I look at the first 2, there they are. Here's the next 2. The third 2 would be here and here. And if you hover over them, I see I have my silver attrited customer. Oh, see, no, I'm not looking at those colors right. Here we go. Silver and silver, whatever 2 colors these are, I apologize. And then this little sliver here is my platinum. And then this sliver, you can't even see this one right here. It's so low, which is only 4 customers. That's why. So this is not necessarily a good graph, but you can do it. You'd have to do a lot of explaining. Your title's horrible. You got to come up with a descriptive title. We've already talked about that. This is not a graph I would look at. But again, I encourage you to play with these. and just see what they do. You know, you can change your vertical bar to a horizontal bar, if that makes sense. An area graph, I wouldn't recommend an area graph here. I don't think that's going to tell us anything too interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting graph. You'd have a little trouble explaining that probably. Right, first of all, you got only 2 colors here, and there's a bunch of colors over here. It's going to be a tough graph to explain. Don't get too cool with your graphs. Don't get too cute with your graphs. I had a lot of people who have worked for me in my practitioner career, and they've tried to create these real fancy, cool graphs. And at the end of the day, you get in front of people and they say, well, what does that mean? What is it? What are you trying to tell me? Remember, your graph has to tell somebody something. All right, let me open this up for questions. I've done a lot of talking and a lot of demonstrating. Who has a question? I've explained this so well that you are now pivot table experts, right? So we logically have how many options? You're pivot table experts now. You've fallen asleep. The third option is you knew pivot tables before you got here. So does anybody have a question? Heather, did you have a question?
I have a question. I just thought it might be a good idea to show them how you can change the way that it looks like the colors. For example, right now you've got blue in the background, and how you can just make this view look a little bit different.
The tabular view?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I've even done much of that. Let me get some of the stuff out of my way here. All this Zoom stuff is all over the place. So if you click on, if you're in your pivot table, I'm assuming we can go to our design, right?
Yes.
Tab. All right. So the design tab, I haven't done much of this because I generally don't give people the tables from pivot. At least in my career, I've done mostly you turn things into visualizations and then talk about visualizations, although many times tables are useful. So Excel has several suggestions of how you can change some of these. If you were going to use this and then copy it into your PowerPoint presentation, perhaps, is this the line you were going down, Heather?
It is, and you can also add like subtotals and grand totals from that area where you just were under design.
Okay, yeah.
See where it says grand total, subtotals, report layout. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can do banded rows. You can play with this, and you can do, like, say you want to do alternating to highlight which ones are your total rows.
And then standard layout where you've got report layout to your left there.
Yep.
Yep. That's been helpful for me.
Okay. So you've used compact form or outline form?
Just playing around with it, absolutely, just to see, how digestible it is. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Tabular form. Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. I haven't much. Insert a blank line after each item. Not a fan of that necessarily, but there might have some application.
Well, being able to take out the grand totals or put them in really quickly here, and also subtotals, so that you can see, if you're looking at a large set of data, like, well, what do the subtotals look like? How is this chunked up? That's a
great point. So the grand totals, if you notice, I can turn them off for rows and columns, and you notice I now do not have the total information for the whole customer set. I can put those back on. And now, I have my grand totals for each column, each row. Let's see here. I can just do rows and not do the columns. I can do the columns, not the rows, depending on what you're going to use this data for. Subtotals, I don't know if it's going to apply with the data I have. I might cover that next time. So you could get rid of the subtotals, right? So now I don't have the totals for blue, gold, platinum, or silver. You can change where the subtotals show. In this case, I now have the subtotals after the data versus on top of the data. Or the group rather. So you can play around with all of those options. That's great, Heather. I appreciate that. I wouldn't have thought to cover that. Again, I don't do much of that. But if you are looking to present a table in some sort of presentation or visual, then you can format your table right here. Great. Take your row headers out. All right, so as I said earlier on, we started this, the best way to deal with pivot tables is get a data set and play around with it. I could sit here and talk till 9 o'clock and still not cover all kinds of stuff that you can do with a pivot table, that you would figure it out. Pivot table analyzed. That really gets us into more of our next class. That gets into more of our next class. We have the ability, if we're using a data source that's outside of this particular worksheet, or let's say, another example of that would be, and I've only got a minute left, but let's say somebody came back and said, hey, we now have another 5,000 rows of data, right? We can plug our 5,000 rows of data at the bottom of the spreadsheet, insert them here. We could go back to our pivot table in that case and just hit this refresh, and the pivot table will recalculate to include your new set of data. If you remember, when we defined this pivot table, we defined it for the data we had right now. If you add data to your data set, it's not going to get included into this pivot unless you refresh the data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our next session, should you choose to join us. All right, it is 7:30, and yet there's a little more I wanted to cover, but that's good. I think we covered quite a bit. I think you have enough information to be dangerous with pivot tables.
So like, I want to ask if we can get the previous 2 sessions, if they were recorded.
They were, Nancy. Thank you for asking. I have not put those anywhere, but I will this week. I actually
Okay.
did not have a folder on the S drive, and I do now have one. So I will communicate to everybody that I have here on this distribution list where I put those recordings.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Excellent question. Anybody else have a question? Feel free to leave if you need to go. It's past 7:30. All right. If not, then I will see you hopefully in our next session. Check the Ignite calendar. I did not pull it up. It's in April. I know that. And we'll do our 4th session, and we'll finish up our visualization and telling the story of the data. If you have questions in between, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to answer your questions. We can go over it. Happy to help in any way I can. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.